think about. So I promised a talk, a wrap-up talk called Dualism and Idealism in the Foundations of Quantum Mechanics, thinking that this was when it was originally going to be the cage match to the death between Kelvin and Marcus, or between dualism and idealism. In the end, that those issues have certainly been present throughout the conference, and I thought, yeah, it still makes sense to some extent to focus on them in this wrap-up talk, which is basically a perspective on all these issues in the foundations of physics and metaphysics and the philosophy of mind from the perspective of a philosopher of consciousness and a philosopher of mind, which is my own area. And that's basically what I'll try to offer here. Really, I mean, I say dualism and idealism, but then other philosophical views in the philosophy of mind are never far away. There's materialism, there's panpsychism, maybe there are some others, but those are perhaps the big four. So I thought, yeah, it makes sense to focus on all four of those here, and to basically see how various talks in the conference fit together. This is going to be a little bit of a mess because I prepared the whole thing at lunchtime. But see, there may still be typos in the slides, but we'll see. Okay, so I thought I could kind of structure all this around a slogan or a sentence or an epigraph. I remember hearing this years ago when I was in graduate school. Sometime in the late 80s or early 90s, I heard this epigraph, and it really stayed with me. And finally, and a few years ago, I came to write an article on idealism, and I wanted to start it with this quote. And I searched and I searched. I could not find this anywhere. This quote that I vividly remembered either somebody saying this to me, or I read it in grad school, but no one. I asked and asked. No one could tell me. I ended up publishing it as in the first paragraph of a paper, probably 4 or 5 years ago now, and still no one has reported ever hearing it. So maybe I don't know if I dreamed it, or if some amazing conversation partner said it to me and then forgot. But anyway. But the claim this is the claim about a kind of a philosophical progression, that in thinking about the mind and its relation to the physical world. I mean, everyone starts as a materialist, but then, of course, you become a dualist, and then you become a panpsychist, and naturally, you end up as an idealist.
Oh, you got it.
What's that?
Oh.
No, I think that's my article. Where Almost. And I think roughly the idea is, in light of modern science at least, materialism is the very natural default view, at least until you come up against the problem of consciousness. You realize, damn, well, yeah, it's hard to see how you explain consciousness in physical terms. So you become a dualist, but then you become a dualist, and now you've got mind and matter are separate from each other, and you've got problems like how do they relate, how do they interact? So you think, okay, well, and then you also maybe you start to think maybe you don't understand the nature of matter all that well after all. So maybe we should become a panpsychist to integrate the mind into the physical world and its foundations. And then at a certain point, you think, well, why do we actually need anything but the mind? John nods knowingly. And thereby say, well, everything is the mind, and you become an idealist. So this is meant to be a natural path. And at least you can find a few philosophers out there who have followed it. Maybe Don, yeah. I don't know. People like some idealists, like maybe John Foster in the philosophical literature. But I certainly resonate with this myself, because I started out myself as a materialist and became a dualist and sympathetic with panpsychism, and I haven't made it all the way. I haven't yet reached full enlightenment, but I entertain idealism. And anyway, I thought that would be a nice lens through which to look at this conference. I mean, well, all of these views, of course, face big problems. which kind of in a way motivates the progression. Materialism faces the hard problem of consciousness. How does it accommodate consciousness? Dualism faces the problem of interaction. How do mind and matter interact consistently with physics? Panpsychism faces the so-called combination problem. How do little bits of mind at the basic level add up to our consciousness? It would be nice if idealism faced no problems at all, so it would be a stable resting ground. But among other things, idealism famously faces the problem of, well, how does the external world fit in if everything is mental? How do we explain the appearance of the external world? So it's not obvious what the resting ground is. But anyway, maybe there's some sense in which you can squint, if you squint at this conference the right way, you can see, okay, well, we're somehow recapitulating this natural progression, and maybe it's interesting to look at some of the conference in light of this of these views and these problems. I tried to break down all the speakers at the conference in terms of their teams, materialist, dualist, panpsychist, idealist. I probably got you wrong. It's like I probably got everybody wrong. Some people get question marks. Other people should have question marks. I mean, I don't know. Not many people came right out and said I'm a materialist. But some people who I think maybe Ian came in. Maybe Ian said more or less that.
Dual aspect monist.
Dual aspect monist. Okay, well that's a whole different. That kind of gets in somewhere towards the end there.
With materialist leanings, though.
Yeah.
I'll say you're right.
Adrian, I think, swings a little bit both ways here, but I think he said in his talk he was trying to go from materialist assumptions. Angelo just presented what seemed to be a pretty materialist picture without a special role for consciousness, and likewise, Janan's picture looked a lot that way. So I put them as materialist. Where dualism is concerned, well, Kelvin presented this consciousness collapse picture, which is pretty explicitly dualistic, and which I don't know if either he or I actually believe it, but we'll represent people by their views here. So I guess we count as dualists for present purposes. Johannes was certainly entertaining the idea that consciousness is non-physical and affects the physical. Lucian expressed some speculative sympathy for dualism. Jeff, I had to categorize before actually hearing the talk, so that was tricky. And I thought we were going to get some stuff about free will and irreducible libertarian free will. It's a little bit dualistic.
Put me as a superposition of all.
Okay, superposition of all the.
Just optimizing for what.
Okay, good. Panpsychism. We had a little bit less explicitly on panpsychism. Probably the closest was Mauro, who said every quantum state involves qualia. That sounds pretty panpsychist. And Don certainly has panpsychist elements in what he says. All these conscious agents out there are associated with every last little. I don't know whether every last little bit of matter and the wave function is associated with the conscious agent.
I'm a full-on idealist, actually. There's no matter except as an interface between agents.
Okay, you're a full-on idealist?
Full-on.
Full-on idealist. Okay, so good. That's right. I gave you no question mark under idealist. Bernardo, clearly an idealist. Don, clearly an idealist. If only Marcus was here, it looks like his view at least leads to a kind of idealism. I'll get to that. Chris denies that he's an idealist, but certainly QBism does have this element. Whenever you talk about the physical world, you're talking about your experiences or your expectations. So I've put in there. Anyway, I'll revisit all of these things in what follows. Some people I found harder to classify because they didn't talk so much about these issues. IIT is almost impossible to pin down here, so I'll get to that in a moment. So Larissa and Leonardo, I've got TBD. And likewise, the Wigner Friends talk. I think we're mostly somewhat neutral on this. I think they were at least consistent with materialism, but maybe some of them were consistent with dualism too. So I've left them out. So those are the teams. But actually, for organizing the tour through the talks, I thought maybe more useful to do it by topics of the different talks and the topics and views explored. I mean, the theme of the conference is actually agency and mind and foundations of physics, foundations of quantum mechanics. I think it was more mind than agency as the conference went along, but there were a few things which were explicitly on agency. I put Janan and Lucian definitely there, and maybe some of Jeff's talk was about agency. We had about 3 on IIT with Ian, Larissa, Leonardo. Then we had a few on different aspects of collapse theories. There were the kind of the physical collapse theories, the more conservative collapse theories based on, localization of position or mass density, and so on. So Angelo, Adrian, Catalina all talked about those, although they did draw some connections to consciousness. And then there are the less conservative collapse theories that tie it to consciousness. So Kelvin's talk, put myself in that category too. Johannes was certainly exploring views like that. And there were the Wigner Friends talks, Eric Howard, Lydia Veronica. There was Mauro's distinctive quantum panpsychism, which moves us in the direction of idealism, Chris on QBism, and then explicitly idealistic Bernardo, Don, and Marcus in absentia. So I thought kind of a tour through those, but from the perspective, materialism, dualism, panpsychism, idealism. Starting with agency. Basically you could see I'm much less of an agency person than a mind and consciousness person. So, this is all I'll say about agency. But I guess you could see Janan's talk as giving a materialist spin on agency, saying, Janan said, well, agency is special in all kinds of interesting ways, these weird interference between action and knowledge and so on. But she also said many of the ways in which it's special are already present in classical physics. This isn't unique to quantum physics and seem largely consistent with a materialist picture. So a story about the specialness of agency that seems very much consistent with materialism. Whereas Lucian, certainly Lucian's talk says something more like agency in quantum physics could turn out to be special in a way that leads to dualism. If you've got the right results on these Bell experiments involving humans, it's a speculation, but then it would turn out to be special in a way that leads to dualism. And before the fact, I put Jeff in this camp as well. So there's default materialism, but maybe one thought is maybe there'll be results from quantum physics that will push you into dualism and send you along on at least the first step of this philosophical progression. IIT, integrated information theory. Well, now we basically face this big question. What on earth is the metaphysical view behind IIT? Is it a form of materialism? Is it a form of dualism? Is it a form of panpsychism? Or is it a form of idealism? Or is it something else entirely? To which the answer is yes. I think possibly, there are versions of it at least, of IIT, which is each of those. And I think it can be understood in each of these ways. You hear slogans you don't hear all these slogans. One slogan you often hear from proponents of IIT is consciousness is integrated information. It's very natural to hear that in such a way that, well, integrated information is something physical. We can define it in physical terms. Here it is, consciousness just is integrated information. It sounds like you're reducing consciousness to integrated information. So that sounds materialist. On the other hand, Giulio is very, very clear that that's not his intention. He doesn't think you can get mind out of matter. He doesn't think you can solve the hard problem in that kind of reductionistic way. Rather, he's very clear he's taking consciousness as fundamental and then trying to relate it to everything else. And that looks in a way inconsistent, at least with standard materialism. So another reading, not I think one endorsed by Giulio and IIT proponents in this way, but one that's a quite common reading of it is, okay, consciousness is not identical to integrated information, but these two things co-vary with each other. It's like, low phi, low consciousness, high consciousness. Phi is at least a measure of consciousness. And these two things, the thing you can measure physically and this phenomenal state, are at the very least strongly correlated, but potentially distinct. This would be consistent then with dualism or property dualism. I quite like this reading of IIT, although I don't know if proponents endorse it. And there's also another slogan you hear, though, sometimes from IIT proponents, which is really consciousness, i.e. integrated information, is all that exists. Those are the only things that genuinely exist. The things which are not conscious don't genuinely exist at all, and that begins to sound idealist. And there's also it also begins to sound panpsychist, at the very least, because you get consciousness in these simple two-element systems, which are, very simple systems being conscious is one hallmark of panpsychism, although strictly speaking, I guess one-element systems have no consciousness. So there will be a bunch of systems with 0 phi. So maybe not everything gets to be conscious, but elements of panpsychism. There's a question about how you formulate panpsychism. Interesting. So how you formulate IIT, interesting in its own right. you might say consciousness goes along with hi-fi, like that was the original phi version. Not so specific, it's just this one-dimensional measure. We talked a lot about the development of IIT, where we've got these complex mathematical structures like Q-shapes or qualia shapes. We say, consciousness goes along with that, with Q-shape. Well, one way I like to express this actually to think of IIT as a theory is, so we define something like a phenomenal Q-shape, which is a structure of consciousness, a mathematical structure that we find in consciousness, and we define some isomorphic structure, which we can find in the physical structure of a system according to the rules of integrated information. Call the first one phenomenal Q-shape, second one physical Q-shape, and say those two things go along with each other. And that's fine for the purposes of, say, an empirical theory. But for classifying these as metaphysical theories, an awful lot here depends on how we interpret that arrow, the double arrow in the middle. I just said goes along with, but yeah, I mean, depending on how you understand that double arrow, that could be understood as materialist. If you understand that double arrow is saying something like just is, consciousness just is hi-fi or is reducible to, consciousness just is Q-shape, phenomenal Q-shapes just are physical Q-shapes, that looks reductionist. And you've got a form of materialism. If you understand the double arrow is more of like a psychophysical law, a law of nature connecting two different things, then it starts to look perhaps like a form of dualism. And I don't know. If you go the other way around, you think that hi-fi and physical Q-shapes are grounded in consciousness, then perhaps you get something closer to idealism. So there are some, an awful lot depends on exactly how we understand this connection here, which is something that IIT is often not very explicit on as far as I can tell. There's an interesting sideline issue here. I mean, a general theme that's been running through the conference and a lot of our discussions about mathematical theories of consciousness. I think interesting independently of this materialism, dualism, idealism issue, which is what is the right way to approach a mathematical theory of consciousness? I mean, one big goal of a mathematical theory of consciousness is, among other things, a mathematical specification of conscious states. So, Johannes is a huge fan of mathematical theories of consciousness, one of the founders of, the Association for Mathematical Conscious Science, and all these conferences on models of consciousness. And it's clearly, there's a big up and coming movement here to, develop theories of consciousness in mathematical terms. And many of the people here are very interested in these mathematical approaches. It's very interesting as a philosopher to reflect on just what's required for a mathematical theory of consciousness. I mean, you might think roughly we're going to need some mathematics of physics and some kind of mapping relation from physics to states of consciousness, a mathematical specification of those. But at least one big part of it, it seems, has to involve a mathematical specification of conscious states, both local conscious states, seeing this, feeling that, and global conscious states, say, at a time or even across time. One nice thing about IIT is at least gives a candidate for that in these Q-shapes or these phi structures that we were talking about on the first day. It's potential mathematical representation of a complete state of consciousness. But this kind of raises the question, is the general philosophical question, is a mathematical specification of conscious states possible? Or is a complete mathematical specification of conscious states possible? I mean, there's at least two different kinds of issues here you might worry about. One is that that structure underdetermines conscious states. So maybe you can find different conscious states with the same mathematical structure. If you can always do that for any structure, then it looks like the mathematical structure will underdetermine the conscious states and can't be a complete specification. I mean, the most obvious kind of example here to worry about is things like qualia inversion cases, or so-called inverted spectra, where maybe you invert red and green with each other, keep the mathematical structure the same. Many people think you can do something like that and do so coherently. Maybe there are some actual asymmetries in color space that make this tricky, but then it looks like you can move to just counterfactual versions where the asymmetries apply slightly differently. Anyway, many people have argued this kind of thing is possible. So there could be beings with the same structure as us, hypothetically, but different, experiencing different qualities. If so, it starts to look like the structure underdetermines the conscious states, to which you can respond in a couple of ways. Either try and argue that kind of asymmetry is impossible, or at least that there's always some kind of structural difference. So maybe red and green are going to have some fundamental structural difference between the two that renders this kind of inversion impossible once you fix that more fine-grained structure. I'm a little skeptical of that myself, although I think it's an interesting strategy. I think there's also a response that involves lowering your sights a little bit, which is aiming for instead of aiming for a mathematical theory of an entire state of consciousness, including its entire qualitative character, aim at least for a mathematical theory of the structural character of consciousness. It's a bit like, mapping, like, say, the three-dimensional structure of color space without pinning down the qualities of redness and greenness within it. And I think if we actually had a mathematical theory of the full structural character of consciousness, that would already be an amazing achievement for a science of consciousness. Maybe it, in some sense, wouldn't be complete, but it would still be amazing. So that's the response I'm inclined by to this one. But as well as this underdetermination issue, I think there's also an interpretation issue, which is rough. How does a mathematical structure specify a state of consciousness? We came up against this one on the first day with IIT, where IIT produces these Q shapes. It's like, great, well, but there are these really weird things, which are, points in some extremely high dimensional space with 5 weights attached to them. And what exactly does that mean about consciousness? It seems that we need this Rosetta Stone that is some kind of interpretation scheme for turning mathematical structures into claims about consciousness. And I don't think that's impossible. I think that ought to be possible, but I think a full mathematical theory of consciousness can't just give you the math. It's also got to give you the Rosetta Stone. It's got to give you that interpretation scheme for turning structures into claims about consciousness. You understand this dimension of the state as, I don't know, some kind of intensity. You understand this as some kind of dimension, and this is as composing that. Anyway, it's a very substantive issue. I think what will such a Rosetta Stone involve? But I think this is a problem we need to solve or to have a full mathematical theory of consciousness. And I'd love to see, mathematical theories like IIT, when they're put forward, actually, put them forward alongside a Rosetta Stone like this, that will make them more complete theories of consciousness. There's also an interesting question about the general form for a mathematical theory of consciousness. Let's call it a Q structure, like a general candidate for the structure, for the mathematical structure of consciousness. And I guess what we really need is, well, here's one way to put it. First, you give a condition under which such a structure is physically realized. So for IIT, that'll come down to, Q shape is physically realized if there's a network of such and such a forms, which are connected to each other by the right conditional probabilities, such that the integrated information, blah, blah, blah. That'll be a big physical condition for a Q structure being physically realized. And we'll also give a definition of what it is for that Q structure to be phenomenally realized, to be realized in experience. And that's a matter of giving certain phenomenal conditions for a Q structure to be present in consciousness. That's a matter of giving the Rosetta Stone. And if you do both of those, and with those two definitions in hand, then you can just give something like a fundamental law, which says a Q structure is physically realized if and only if it's phenomenally realized. So under these mathematical conditions, you'll get the physical realization of a Q shape. Whenever that happens, you'll then get the phenomenal realization. This actually gets interestingly close to what I called the double aspect theory of information back in my 96 book, where the whole idea was, whenever certain information spaces are physically embodied, they're also experientially embodied. I quite like this as a general, it's an interesting question whether this is a general form for a mathematical theory of consciousness or just a specific form, but it's one that I find very appealing. And then it's just a matter of, okay, we have to figure out the right structures and the right conditions for physical realization, the right Rosetta Stone, and we're done. Okay, that was a bit of a sideline on mathematical theories of consciousness, a bit distinct from the main line, but Johannes said, you got to talk about the structure of the mathematical structure of consciousness. So that was for you, Johannes.
Appreciate it.
Okay, now getting back to some of the main lines of the meeting, we had a lot of discussion of collapse theories of quantum mechanics. Okay, where do they leave things with IIT? I guess IIT could be materialist, but it looks like it doesn't work because of the hard problem. So yeah, IIT is more naturally understood as dualist or perhaps even idealist. So it's pushing us in that direction. Maybe we get some similar pressure from collapse theories of quantum mechanics, or at least potentially. So collapse theories supplement or modify the Schrödinger equation with collapse dynamics. Arguably, something like this is present even in textbook quantum mechanics, which says you've got these two processes, Schrödinger evolution of the wave function, and then when you make a measurement, the quantum state changes in a special way, looks like collapse. So that looks like what you can call a measurement collapse theory. Of course, then people complain measurement is totally vague and it's not a precise condition. So people then have tried to articulate more precise theories. Most well known are the spontaneous physical collapse theories that we've talked a lot about, GRW, CSL, Dioschi-Penrose, and so on. We've also talked here about the consciousness collapse theories, which at least Kelvin and I have tried to argue can be articulated in a precise form. So, you know, they're much more conservative and on the face of it consistent with materialism. A materialist picture are these physical collapse theories, GRW, CSL, DP, which give physical conditions for collapse based on maybe some condition involving mass density, maybe gravitational relations, structures of space-time. These look pretty nicely physicalist. On the other hand, you might think, well, but the writing is on the wall for these theories. They're gradually being refuted and eliminated. It's like those movies where, like, you know, there's 20 people on the island at the beginning, kill them off one by one until yeah. So yeah, all of these looks like we're those ominous diagrams by Angelo the first day. Yeah, the ground is closing up. Now there's only that tiny little square left in the middle for physical collapse theories. It looks like before too long, all those standard, at least, physical collapse theories are going to be eliminated. And likewise, Catalina's talk was doing the same thing. It's great that these theories are testable, but not so great because it means they'll be tested, and you know most people would say almost certainly eliminated. So those nice, straightforward, easy physical collapse theories may start to disappear. Now, around then, there's going to be a question. Okay, we could just give up on collapse theories entirely, but clearly that's not logically forced on us. There are other collapse theories out there. And, you know, one interesting question, what the best alternative is, but, you know, the most obvious alternative perhaps is to move to new collapse theories that bring in different collapse operators, not quite as simple and as universal as those, you know, mass density collapses. Angelo was very clear that, you know, that there's this basic equation for a collapse theory that allows arbitrary collapse operators. And those could correspond in principle to, you know, very high level physical observables, maybe things that only come in with systems of a pretty high degree of complexity. Maybe, you know, if it's an IIT based one, only comes in when phi is above some quite significant threshold. I mean, interesting question whether a theory like that is more materialist or more dualist. Arguably, that kind of view is already somewhat dualistic. It's at least got, you know, because it's got these high-level physical states which exert some kind of downward causal role in collapse. That's at least a version of what people call sometimes strong emergence or strong downward causation. It needn't be an effect of consciousness. This could go on maybe just for some complicated biological property, but it's already at least somewhat dualistic in its form. And it's also got the property that we can gradually experimentally test these theories as, you know, our experiments with interferometers or quantum computers get better and better. We can't test these theories easily now, but we'll eventually be able to. Yeah, so one thought is we'll keep doing those experiments and gradually rule out, okay, collapse in, you know, they ruled out collapse in Buckminster fullerene molecules, and we'll gradually rule out collapse in, I don't know, in microtubules and in cells, and maybe, I don't know, flies, but then maybe at some point it'll stop, and then oh my God, you get collapse at this level. That will be super interesting. You know, one thought, one extreme case here is that one point in logical space here, one attractive point in logical space, which I think gets more and more attractive the more you eliminate the simple collapse theories, is the consciousness collapse theory, which could be understood as, I think consciousness collapse theories are consistent with materialism. If you say consciousness is itself a high-level physical property, then that would be collapsed by a high-level physical property. But I think it tends to be more, then you just have downward physical causation. But I think it's more natural and more common to understand these theories as forms of dualism, with consciousness as a non-physical property, not governed directly by the Schrödinger equation, which is what enables it to play this special role and resist quantum superpositions and bring about collapse. And clearly Wigner intended it as a form of dualism, and Kelvin and I, in our treatment of it, also intended that way, not least as trying to overcome some of the standard problems for dualism. I mean, the standard problem for dualism, as I mentioned, is how does the non-physical world, non-physical consciousness, how does it interact with the physical world? Doesn't closure of the physical, in fact, rule this out? Doesn't, you know, if physics is closed, how can consciousness get in there? So in our article, Kelvin and I tried to argue at least that consciousness collapse is consistent with known physics. We can develop this in a way that isn't experimentally refuted by anything we know right now, and maybe is a little bit suggested by the existence of collapse in standard quantum mechanics, but at least consistent. It was nice to see Johannes's talk today, which seems to be making heading towards at least a stronger claim, which would seem to be more like, if you want to be an interactionist dualist with a role for consciousness in affecting physical goings on in the physical world, then you basically have to be a consciousness collapse theorist. Consciousness has to resist, has to break down superpositions. So that's I mean, I'm a tiny bit skeptical about some of the details, but it would be very nice if it's true that interactionist dualism has to take this form. I was worried about, versions where maybe consciousness serves as something like a fifth force and gets built into the Hamiltonian. Maybe you could have some non-collapse effects of consciousness, but still, I like the idea that it suggests that especially neat mathematical motivation for consciousness collapse theories, especially if one wants to be an interactionist, that holds out the hope of, solving the interaction problem with a consciousness collapse theory. Of course, it's going to be a hostage to fortune, and the empirical results are going to have to come out the right way eventually. And few would be terribly optimistic that they will, but we can wait and see. Anyway, this does offer, to combine a couple of strands here, this offers the possibility of a mathematical consciousness collapse theory. As Kelvin and I have argued, we can combine a mathematical theory of consciousness like IIT with a mathematical theory of collapse like CSL or Bassi's generalized form of this. And it's going to turn out that, Kelvin already said in his talk that the most basic form of this with standard IIT serving as the mathematical theory of consciousness is either already refuted by quantum computer experiments or will very soon be refuted by easy to perform experiments. So simple versions will be easy to falsify. Simple versions which have, very liberal theories of consciousness, consciousness is everywhere. But versions of these theories with less liberal theories of consciousness seem to be left open, only if consciousness arises at a high degree of complexity, for example. Those are at least harder to falsify. I mean, one can in principle test all of these, but the experiments just get harder and harder. Still, if we ever get to some level here where we do all the interferometry experiments and we just don't get superpositions, and it looks like, you cannot get superpositions at this level. Or if we build quantum computers where they break down, if we ever find these collapse effects, I think that wouldn't prove that consciousness is collapsing the wave function. But I think against the light of this background of theoretical options, it would at least be some evidence for this is exactly what you would expect if consciousness collapses the wave function. So you might think we get at least some Bayesian evidence for the idea that A, that consciousness is collapsing, and B, that this is the locus of consciousness. I mean, ultimately, the kind of experiments you might want to do here are basically Wigner friends experiments to see if humans collapse the wave function. If humans don't collapse the wave function, then all this is probably going to be rather ill-motivated. But you can test that hypothesis with Wigner friend style experiments where you try and put humans into quantum superpositions, or as I think Eric and Howard were saying, if that turns out to be really difficult for biological reasons, we can try and do the same thing, at least with like humanoid AIs that we build on quantum computers. And then the question is, so just say you put a human into a Wigner friend experiment and try and put them into a superposition, see if you get interference effects or collapse effects. One possibility is you get no collapse effects, and it looks like humans enter superpositions. Okay, that's pretty bad news for the consciousness collapse theory at that point. So we've pretty much been empirically refuted. I mean, you could say things like, well, only under certain circumstances does consciousness collapse the wave function. The rest of the time it enters superpositions, but that starts to take away some of the motivation. So if this happened, and who knows? I'd probably at that point give up on consciousness collapse and endorse something else like a many worlds view. If, on the other hand, we do find those collapse effects, humans don't enter superpositions. In this case, observation is not unitary. It looks like humans do collapse wave functions. At that point, I'd be like, okay, well, that is looking pretty good for a consciousness collapse view. I think it doesn't prove that consciousness is doing the work, but I think it would be very strong evidence for that. Well, as I say, this is extremely speculative that the empirical results would go this way, but it is an empirical hypothesis, and hopefully eventually we'll be able to do this. Probably sooner with humanoid AIs than with humans. And that is always going to leave open the escape route that, humanoid AIs can't collapse the wave function, but humans can, because there's something different, something special about the human case compared to the humanoid AI case. But that'll be an argument to have, when and if we ever do these experiments. Okay, so that's kind of the materialism and dualism half of this. I kind of see this as, this isn't quite the standard line from the hard problem from materialism to dualism, but kind of a potential empirical route from materialism to dualism, from thinking about quantum mechanics and collapse to maybe consciousness collapses the wave function. If we got the right experimental results, if it turns out that experimentally humans do collapse the wave function, but oscilloscopes don't or whatever, then maybe at that point, okay, great, we've solved the interaction problem, we've got a nice view here, and we can rest with consciousness collapse dualism. If, on the other hand, things don't empirically go our way, then this solution to the interaction problem for dualism, the consciousness collapse solution, is ruled out. That would be a shame, because it seemed like it was our best solution, but that's science. That'll be ruled out. That then makes the interaction problem for dualism so much harder. And remember, the interaction problem for dualism was the one that motivated moving beyond step 2 in the progression. We thought we had a potential solution to it, but if empirically we don't, then perhaps avoiding the interaction problem for dualism, plus as well as avoiding the hard problem for physicalism, is what motivates the move to panpsychism. So let me just say a bit about panpsychism before then moving to idealism. I mean, one panpsychist idea that people often think about in combining panpsychism with ideas about consciousness in quantum mechanics is, okay, consciousness collapses the wave function, and consciousness is everywhere in the panpsychist way. Even photons are conscious. Okay, that view is a disaster. Basically, if everything is conscious and consciousness collapses the wave function, everything will collapse the wave function all the time. Photons will never be able to go through the 2 slits at once. You never get an interference effect. So basically, this is ruled out. At least the extreme version of this is ruled out by existing quantum effects. And in general, I think panpsychism and consciousness collapse are 2 views that you don't want to combine. Maybe there's some fancy way you can do it, but I actually think of those are 2 different. Although I'm sympathetic with both those views, panpsychism and collapse, I'm never sympathetic with both at once. It's like one hemisphere likes panpsychism, the other hemisphere likes dualism, and those are very much different alternatives. But if we're now going with we're now setting aside the dualist hemisphere and going with the panpsychist hemisphere, then we've got other forms of panpsychism. Instead of panpsychism collapsing the wave function, maybe there's the idea the whole wave function was basically a state of consciousness to begin with. But this isn't far from Maurer's view. in his very nice talk that all quantum states involve qualia. Qualia I basically take to be basically another word for phenomenal consciousness or conscious experience, or at least the qualities thereof. I mean, that view, as stated, I think as Maurer stated, it seemed to be both consistent with both a materialist reading, a physics first reading, and what we might call a consciousness first reading. On the physics first reading, it looks like, it's a bit like the mind-brain identity theory. Consciousness is just a state of the brain. The quantum qualia identity theory would say qualia just are physical quantum states of the kind specified in quantum mechanics. That looks like a reductionist theory, subject to the hard problem, the explanatory gap, and so on. It's not totally clear why we should endorse that over other forms of the identity theory. On the other hand, there's also the consciousness first version of this view that says something more like, the qualia or consciousness is actually fundamental. We're not trying to reduce it to anything. But maybe, for example, the quantum states that quantum mechanics actually talks about, these mathematical objects, what they ultimately are in their intrinsic nature is states of qualia. This is the view which has come to be known as Russellian monism in the philosophy literature, that when physics describes things mathematically, that's quite consistent with those things actually being states of consciousness. It's like intrinsically they're states of consciousness. The relations to each other are described mathematically in this form. And I think this, this panpsychist quantum state, quantum mechanics can be understood as a version of this. So these quantum states, physics characterizes them mathematically, but ultimately what it's characterizing the states of qualia with consciousness at the bottom level. I mean, probably ultimately this is going to lead to, the whole wave function is basically a state of consciousness. And then you say, whose state of consciousness? And it gets complicated. Is that a single state or many states? I mean, the big problem for panpsychism is the combination problem. How does micro consciousness in fundamental physics add up to macro consciousness, the kind that we have? If our consciousness derives from micro consciousness at the bottom level, how does that work? William James said, when you line up 10 subjects in a row, you don't just get an 11th one coming along for free as the combination of those. So why, when you put together a trillion particles, do you get us as the result? Well, I think this is a point that actually motivates quantum mechanics a bit, and I think Maurer said some nice things on this subject. There's the idea, which a couple of people have explored. I mentioned David Pearce the other day, that quantum holism might work as what we might call quantum holism is potentially a solution to the subject combination problem, because when two fundamental particles are entangled, what's really fundamental is not those particles, but the system, but the entangled system, which has a quantum state of its own. Its quantum state is fundamental, not the states of the individual particles. So you might think, okay, quantum entanglement gives you a mechanism by which microsubjects can combine into macrosubjects, or at the very least, maybe it could turn out that a macro system in the brain, an entangled macro system, would itself have a fundamental quantum state that could correspond to a state of consciousness. And I mean, there are lots of questions you might raise for that, like how you have to make sure that the entanglement is maintained in the hot and messy conditions of the brain with decoherence. How's that going to work? But nonetheless, I think it's a conceptually interesting solution to the combination problem to think about. I think it works best for what we might call the subject combination problem. How do you get macro subjects from micro subjects? It may still face the quality combination problem. How do those qualia combine? I think Maurer said he had a story about that, but I'd like to see it. There's also a big, what I call structural mismatch problem. How does the physical structure of the wave function seems very different from the phenomenal structure of qualia? David Pearce has put a bet that there will be a commonality there, but okay, this is a very interesting idea, but I think it does face the combination problem, and maybe the combination problem is part of what motivates the step from panpsychism to idealism. And the biggest motivation here is maybe if panpsychism is true, why do we need anything non-mental? We've got all this mental stuff at the bottom level. Yeah, who needs the other stuff? And you might say likewise, if panpsychist quantum mechanics is true, if these quantum states all involve qualia, then why have anything but qualia in your quantum states or in your state of the world? So that's a path to idealism. Idealism is the view that everything is mental, or at least that everything is grounded in the mental, including the apparent physical world, all grounded in the mental. So that gets us to our last station. In my article on idealism, I separated out about 3 different versions of idealism. But a lot of people think about idealism. They think about the version where everything is grounded in the mental states of an observer, of a conscious subject like us, who's looking at the world, looking at the tree, looking at the walls. All that is grounded in an observer's mental states. Typically, maybe a human observer, or at least a macro subject like a human or an animal. I call that macro idealism. Everything gets grounded in our mental states. We can contrast this with the kind of micro idealism that you get more directly out of, say, panpsychism. If you take panpsychism and then just supplement it with the claim that there's nothing non-mental, then it starts to look like everything is grounded in the mental states of microphysical entities, particles or whatever has fundamental quantum states. Okay, that's another possible view. The other possible view is what I call cosmic idealism, where, micro idealism, you've got zillions of tiny conscious minds adding up to reality. Cosmic idealism, you have a single cosmic mind, and maybe the universe as a whole has a conscious state, and that grounds reality. Some versions of this are religious, so you have a divine mind. Berkeley ended up having a divine mind grounding this. Interestingly, I think we saw potential versions of all 3 of these forms of idealism at the workshop. I think Chris's QBism, insofar as it looks idealist at all, looks kind of closest to macro idealism. It's this, the quantum states for him are basically the expectations or subjective probabilities of observers like us. When we give quantum state descriptions, those are basically all referring to mental states, expectations, subjective probabilities. And in fact, he says, so does all talk about physical objects. I talk about the table. I'm still talking about my mental states, at least the subjective probabilities I should have. This is very reminiscent of a near relative of idealism called phenomenalism, most associated with John Stuart Mill, where he says all talk of physical objects is actually talk of mental states. Mill said permanent possibilities of sensation. I kind of see Chris's view as a version of phenomenalism here. Maybe we can call it quantum phenomenalism. No, that's going to be QBism. I don't know if that works. Yeah, we're at least in talking about quantum states, we're talking about these mental states, and maybe all our talk about the physical world has that character. Chris actually, Chris denied that he's an idealist. At least he says he's not committed to it. He says maybe there could be an external world out there. I mean, one version of, and that brings out, there are actually 2 versions of phenomenalism. Phenomenalism can be idealist. It can say the external world is, everything is purely mental. It can also be more analogous to Kant's transcendental idealism. Kant said, well, maybe there's a world beyond the world of appearances. It's just we can't talk about it and we can't know it. That's actually interesting. Not far from some things that Chris says about the external world. He says, I'm not opposed to the external world. Maybe there is one. It's just quantum mechanics is not about it. And when you press him, it's, when we talk about tables, we're not really talking about that either. So there may be an external, non-mental world, but physics just doesn't tell us anything about it. I mean, he combines this with a certain kind of pragmatism, and it's a bit hard to pin down here, but his view starts to look a little like Kant's transcendental idealism around here. Okay, that's the macro idealism, but probably the biggest problem for macro idealism, where everything comes down to our experiences, is what explains the regularities in our experiences. I mean, the famous problem of the tree and the quad. I look at the tree, I go away, I come back next day, the tree's still there. Wow, if that's all just my experiences, what enforces my experiences being the same from day to day? The physicalist has an answer, it's the tree. You just look at the tree and it always comes back. But it starts to look as if we need something beyond our experiences to explain the regularities in them. Berkeley at this point appeals to God's mind. It's like, remember those limericks? One limerick is about, why is the tree always around in the quad? And the other one says, the tree is here because of me, signed, yours faithfully, God. So yeah, you can have an external world like God's mind to explain it, but ultimately it looks like that mind needs to be very complex. It's got to ground all of physics. I mean, the solutions here, I think, are either to move to cosmic idealism or to panpsychist idealism. Cosmic idealism I've already touched on. Berkeley basically has a divine mind that does all this work. You know, Bernardo, I think, has a version of cosmic idealism where the universe basically is one single cosmic mind, and we are all parts of it, and that will ground all of physics and ground the regularities in our experiences. There's also panpsychist idealism, where it's not a single cosmic mind that does this, but a multitude of conscious minds. I think maybe Don's view looks closer to this, with this manifold of conscious agents out there, you get the structure of physics out of the relations among these conscious agents, and conscious agents distinct from ourselves ground the external world. So I think those are the natural solutions here. I think the problems that arise now are, at least one big problem that arises for both views is the combination problem again. You've basically got this dilemma. Where do we come from? Do we come from that cosmic mind? Are we grounded in the cosmic mind? Are we grounded in the micro subjects? So does the idealist external world ground macro subjects like us? If we say yes, then we've got the combination problem. How do those conscious agents add up to me? How does that cosmic subject add down to me? How do I somehow come out of that? I think Bernardo, Don, and Mauro all have things to say about that, but this is often the point at which these views reach maximal resistance. You might say no, and say, okay, we are actually autonomous from those things. There's the cosmic mind, and there's us, and we're just different minds interacting with each other. But now we do face a version of the interaction problem for dualism, which is, hey, isn't that cosmic mind causally closed, and how does my mind interact with it? And you get all the issues of interaction arising again. So there's at least worries for idealists there. I thought I would end all this with just a paean to Marcus's wonderful view that we would have heard so much about if Marcus had been here. Because Marcus, in his amazing paper, Law Without Law, has a story where you actually try and get to be a macro idealist. Everything is grounded in our experiences without an external world, which something I previously thought was impossible. But Marcus has convinced me it could be possible. All that exists is our experiences, and on the simple model, we just have a sequence of experiences, one after another. Regularities among our experiences are explained by his ultimate law of universal induction, which is your experience at time n plus 1 is determined by the algorithmic probability of that experience at time n. That is, look at the list of possible computer programs that will generate the series of experiences from 1 through n and assign probabilities to each of these according to their length, and then assign your prediction of the next experience based on the probability associated with those programs. So, the ones generated by the simplest programs will be the most probable, but not guaranteed. You'll occasionally have improbable things happen. Anyway, you can make a very nice case that this is ultimately going to lead probabilistically to some pretty stable laws of nature that generate a pretty consistent pattern of experiences, even without an external world, just with an ontology of experiences. So it's a very beautiful picture. I think there's lots of questions that arises. Does universal idealism allow genuine intersubjectivity? Do other people really exist, or are they just patterns in our experience? Or just solipsism? And I think more deeply, can it really explain the appearance of an external world as opposed to a mere internal world of our experiences? Anyway, I think I'm probably way over time, so let me conclude. So then, final question, is the best terminus for philosophical reflection on consciousness and physics materialism, dualism, panpsychism, or idealism? Is it something entirely new and different? Well, I don't think we're in a position to answer those questions yet here, but we have seen all kinds of interesting ways in which not just philosophical reflection, but also experimental metaphysics and reasoning and mathematics can all bear on this question. So I say, stay tuned for future versions of this workshop where everything will be revealed. Thank you.
David, that was a great wrap up. Does anyone have any questions for David? Go on in.
I don't have a question, I have a comment. I will just say that if anything could convince me to shed my materialist leanings, it would be Marcus's Law Without Law, because I do very much like that theory.
If only he'd been here, so we could have refuted it. As it is, he gets to survive for another year or two.
The title is law without law, but then
What's
he
it?
completely defines the law,
Yeah,
right?
that's true. That's true. Yeah. Well, that explains the first word of the title, not the second two. Law without physical law. Maybe that's it. Experience, yeah.
Well, the quote, it's a quote from Wheeler, is what it is.
Oh, yeah, that's true. So, John, did I get your view right?
Yes,
Panpsychist idealism?
yeah, where of course I'm not identifying the individual agents with individual particles in space. Yeah, so just abstract agents as conscious entities interacting and then creating space and time as an interface that they use to interact with each other. But they could have other agents could have completely different interfaces. So our space time is just one of infinitely many interfaces that agents can use.
Do we have one agent for the whole quantum wave function, or will there be like a whole bunch of agents?
Well, agents do combine, and so ultimately there is one agent, but it's so complicated, I can't even wrap my head around what that would even mean right now. But the mathematics says there is one agent. I can't even comprehend it. But yeah, so you're somewhere between panpsychism now and idealism, or?
I got half my mind, like one hemisphere likes dualism and the consciousness collapse model. One hemisphere likes something in the vicinity of panpsychism or idealism. Probably, if I had to choose around there, maybe I'd go for a form of cosmic idealism, but I'm not sure. Then I also like forms of neutral monism, where maybe there's something more basic than either physics or consciousness that generates both. But mostly I'm confused.
Right. And I think the difference between the cosmic version versus the panpsychic, if you actually have a solution to the combination problem, then you can have both, right? Because you can have essentially something that's a bunch of little agents, but this combination says there's also one, so you can talk about a cosmic one, and then view all the individual ones as projections of this big cosmic one.
So which is primary for you, the little ones or the cosmic one?
Well, since my mind is not capable of understanding the cosmic one, I'm having to crawl my way up. But
Then so you do need a solution to the combination problem then for the little
that's
ones
right. So
to
that's
add
why
up to the big one.
present that thing about going to the kernel's dropping rank and so forth and creating new conscious agents, because that's exactly what we have to do. So we need to pursue that combination. But we do have a mathematical thing that looks promising there. When you drop rank, 2 becomes 1, or n becomes 1.
Okay, cool. We'll have to look at that.
I can send you some stuff.
So, sorry.
Yeah.
To answer this question, and do you think that God exists or not? That is the background to answer this question.
I'm most inclined to say no. However, in recent years, I've gotten just a little more sympathetic, at least with the idea that there might be a creator, by thinking about the so-called simulation hypothesis, that we could be in a computer simulation. I'm open to the idea that we're in a computer simulation. If so, there's very likely someone who created the simulation, the programmer. They may not be godlike in many respects. They needn't be especially wise or wonderful, but they could be said in some sense to have created our world. So I'm open to that kind of naturalistic God, not so much, standard supernatural gods.
Just a small comment, but I once presented our model in Amsterdam, and about half the audience were philosophers, but then there was half theologians, and there was a theologian there who was disturbed by the idea of consciousness causing collapse, because he accepted 2 claims. One is that anything essential to our consciousness is essential to God's consciousness. So God would cause collapse for whatever he measures, and God is observing everything. The thought being, if that theological hypothesis is true, then you get the same sort of problem that
We have to get the quantum Zeno effect.
Yeah,
God is constantly measuring anything, so nothing can ever happen.
So he was quite concerned by this. And so if that theory turns out to be true, then certain theological hypotheses are going to get refuted.
Maybe God is not subject to the rule of resisting superposition. Maybe God is even capable of having a massively superposed consciousness.
That would be a different theology.
Yeah.
It depends on what psychedelics God is doing.
Yeah. No accident. This happened in Amsterdam.